Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and last week I designed a quilt using a computer software system, and it's called EQ8, and I was able to change my mind many different times. Well, I'm going to change my mind one more time and then make that quilt. I started with a quick quilt project, changed the layout and changed the color, and I was able to get a very quick quilt. I've gone through my fabric and I've chosen some fabric I'd like to make with this. Once I open my sketchbook, I'm going to be able to search for the quilt that I want to work on. I can click edit and I can continue working on this quilt right where I left off. I have a very old fabric line of this great black fabric with a little bit of a gold. And this black that reads as a solid, it has a little bit of speckles of gold in it. And I'm going to pull that together with a white. So I want to change my color layout. Now we can always download the fabric if it's recent, but in this case, I'm just going to find something that's sort of similar. I'm going to go right up at the top to libraries. When I click on that library button, I have some choices to make. And what I want is the fabric library. I have the default that's set up, but I also can choose other fabrics. From here, I'm going to be able to scroll and find something that's going to be similar to this. I'm going to choose this one right here. Click on it and then add it to the sketchbook. I'm going to close up that window so I can color that quilt in. My color will now be at the end of this color palette. I can click on that and that is now the color or the fabric I'm going to paint with. So I'm going to change the colors and I can use that swap tool. And by clicking on any one of those colors, it's going to change the entire thing. I'm going to use a solid black where the yellow used to be. Click onto my black, the button will remain the same. I need to click on any of that yellow and it's going to change it all to black. One click and it's done. I will be taking off one border, that first little border. Go into borders, select that first border and delete. The very last border on here is representing my binding. So I want to change that to know exactly how much binding I'm going to need. So I'm going to just click on that border. From here, I can change the size to the size of the binding that I like to cut. By changing this, when I go to print out the fabric requirements, it's going to add in the amount that I need for my binding. Now I can go back in and work on the quilt. From here, I'm going to just make a couple of different changes. Once I'm happy with the layout, I'm going to save it. And I'm also going to change the fabric of the binding. And I'll just change it something that's not in this quilt at all. So I'll go and do a gray. When I print out the fabric, it gives me the math for the 3 fabrics I'm going to use. And that gray will give me my binding math. If I'm going to have my binding in black, then I will add those measurements together. From here, I can print out all of the pages just like I did before. I do like to print out that coloring page so I can put all of my measurements on it. And I do put the cut sizes on this page. For example, my sashing is cut 12.5 inches by 2.5 inches. And I also make a note, I'm going to need 24 of them. Same with the borders and all of the little squares. And I do like to make a note that this is my binding and I will need 5 strips cut at the 2.5 inches. Between this piece and my blocks, I'm going to start cutting out my fabric. This page represents one block. It's telling me this patch needs to be cut 4 times for the one block, so I know I'm going to have to multiply that by 4 times for the 4 blocks. And from here you can cut each unit at a time, and eventually you're going to have a stack of all the pieces that you need. I personally like to cut my larger pieces first. And in this case, I have those large sashing strips. They're cut 2.5 inches by 12.5 inches. After those long strips are cut, I will have pieces left over. With these leftover pieces, I'm going to find one of the blocks that would be closest to this size. So I'm starting with my largest measurement and I'm going down. I was able to cut the blocks that need to be 2.5 inches by 8.5 inches. I start with my largest piece and then I will try to use the leftovers on those pieces and then just keep cutting strips and making my stacks to all the pieces that I need. Then it's a matter of putting it together like a puzzle piece. So this chain block, I'm going to need a total of 4. I do like to lay the block out as it's going to look. So I have 4 in each of these piles because I need a total of 4 blocks. From here I'm going to be able to sew them together just like I would any quilt block. With my at a glance page, I lay out my sashing, my first border, and my binding. For the Ohio Star, I will need a total of 5 blocks. And within that block, I have 4 of these quarter triangle squares. And these can be made in your favorite method. I like to start with 5.5-inch squares, sew them on the diagonal, cut them, put them back together, sew them, and cut them to get this shape. But you can use any method you want, or you can cut the exact measurements and then just sew them together. One way to make these quarter square triangles is to start with a square at 5.5 inches. I'll add all of these notes in the description so you can follow along. So for the entire quilt, I will need 10 squares at 5.5 inches from both of those colors. I'm going to place those 2 fabrics together, my darker one and my white one. Draw a line from corner to corner, and then we need to stitch on each side of that line because that will become a cutting line. But there will be one additional cutting line, but it's going to go from the other 2 corners. Because I already have the mark going from this corner to corner, my first cut is going to go on the opposite. Line up that ruler and cut. Now when that comes apart, I will be able to cut my second line following my drawn line. If you cut apart on the line that you've drawn first, then you really don't know where that cutting line is going to be for the second cut. Then I can cut this apart. And this needs to be done to all of the 10 sets. From here, we're going to be able to just take that seam and press it to the darker fabric. I will have 4 triangles, 2 with the dark on one side and 2 with the dark on the other side. And that's fine because we're just going to take those pieces and sew them back together. So we can flip those pieces, nestle those 2 seams together, stitch that 1/4 inch. From here, we're going to be able to open this up and trim it down to a 4.5-inch block. We can also trim it down before we press this open. If you happen to have a triangle square up ruler, this is a great time to use it. I'll be looking for that 4.5-inch mark. This 4.5-inch line is going to fit over top of the stitching line. So you'll see that 1/4 inch seam allowance on one side and the 1/4 inch coming from the other. And by using a 5.5-inch square, we don't have a lot to trim off, so we're not wasting a lot of fabric. And by keeping this straight line along both the seams, the front and the back, that tip is going to come out perfect. When we take that ruler off and we open it up, those seams are going to come right to the end. We can trim off those dog ears. So now when we go to press this open, we will have a perfect 4.5-inch square. And this now becomes this piece. For myself, I do like to have all of my blocks on their own boards. So I have a board for the chain, a board for the Ohio Star, and then a separate board for the sashing and the borders and the binding. This helps keep me straight, and I can take one board at a time and go to the sewing machine and sew all of those blocks. When that block is done, I can get the next board and so on. So I'm going to sew all of these blocks together. From here, we're going to be able to lay out the quilt and add the sashing in between each of those blocks. And the last thing I need to do is put on that big fat border. I'll put 2 borders on, and then 2 borders will have cornerstones on each side, and they'll go on the opposite side. And then I will have all of my borders done. And the quilt top is now done. The bonus is I already have my binding cut and ready to go. That's why I like to add it into the quilt pattern so that I have it when I do get around to quilting it. So the notes that I have on my pattern, I start and I write how many blocks I need to make. I need 5 for this particular quilt. I have the measurements that I need for the one block, so I can just multiply and know how many patches I'm going to need. And then I figure out how many widths of fabric I'm going to need to cut. And in this case, I'm going to cut 3 widths of fabric at 4.5 inches. And that's going to give me the 20 blocks. So each of them, I make the notes. And I also make the notes for each block. So each piece has its own cutting directions. And that way, as I'm making the pattern, if I want to change the fabric, I can. The information on the bottom will tell you this is a 12-inch block, and that is a finished block. So sometimes I'll just write that 12.5 inch just to remind me at a glance. The yardage is printed out for me, and I did do that binding in a different color just so that the computer would do the math for me. Even though I will be cutting that in the black, I just wanted it separate in case I changed my mind. So my entire pattern will be my quilt front, and there you can see that little binding that I want, how much fabric I'm going to need, my at a glance page, and my blocks. I'll put a link in the description to all the handouts and with all of my handwritten notes. This will give you a good idea on how I like to mark up my patterns. It's fun to be able to take that computer and change your mind as many times as you want. And then when you do get it down on paper, you'll be able to make the finished project. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode on how I like to design my quilts. And as always, thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.